Hi, I'm Elizabeth Cooper, your host for the Queer Body Love Speaker Series. And today I am so excited to talk with Tobias Olajuwon about Black Queer Flow and all of their amazing work. We were just chatting and I feel like they talked about having a braingasm, and I feel like that's what I'm experiencing right now, even just thinking about the conversation we're about to have. Brilliant mind, a lot of really fascinating and eloquent ideas in relation to the topic of this series. So without further ado, hello, welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. So you're an author, scholar, advocate. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience about who you are in the world?
Yeah. So as we were talking about earlier, I just finished law school, so I do a lot of legal work and mediation. I'm also a poet, and as we were saying earlier, I released my first book last January, Godless Circumcisions, A Recollecting and Remembering of Blackness, Queerness, and Flows of Survivance, which is poems, essays, and culture critiques about the Black, queer, and the experience of people of color in the United States in their quest for survival and fulfillment.
Awesome. So the question of the series, how do we love ourselves, our bodies, and each other in the face of oppression? What are your current thoughts on that question?
Yeah, we spoke about this a little bit earlier, and like I said, I had so many thoughts, and this is what we were talking about, the braingasm. I've been thinking a lot about the interactions between Black people and the police, particularly the violence, as in almost a type of like queer interaction. So, we heard about New York, the stop and frisk, and folks kind of like almost automatically being their bodies being violated in particular ways. So this kind of like this rush to interaction, this rush to touch is a particular type of queer interaction. Not as we see queer as this kind of like sexual thing, but also in a way that is sexual, but not necessarily erotic in the bedroom is the way we think about it. So it's like when we think about like loving our bodies as Black and Black queer people, what does it mean to love your body when death is on its way? Or that death is something that's inevitable. And so for me, it seems that we kind of have like two options, right? We can be on high racial anxiety all the time, knowing that or believing that our love is something that's being wasted in the wind. Or we can be open up to these new possibilities, knowing that perhaps death is always on the horizon. But if death is always coming, how do we practice living? And so that's the kind of question I begin to think about. If life is so short, how do I maximize it? How do I be as free as possible in this moment? And that's not to say that's not a Herculean effort, and that's not scary, and that's not like, holy shit, I'm about to die. I could possibly die right now. But it's like, in this moment, when I am practicing the ability to breathe as me, how do I breathe as me, fully as me, anywhere I am? And how do I teach someone else to do that? And how do I teach someone else to love me while I'm breathing as me, as they're breathing as them, without us taking each other's oxygen away? I think that becomes the real question, is like, how do we love each other without practicing communal euthanasia? Because sometimes we begin to think about love as a type of parasitic interaction with another person. We kind of take them in order to be ourselves, so they're not competing with our space or dismantling who we think we are in the space.
Can you say a little bit more about that communal euthanasia? What does that look like or feel like?
Yeah, so when I was talking with a professor, I was in this like child abuse class. This is kind of slightly off topic, but I'll veer back to it. Try these experiences that I make things make sense. But anyway, we're in this class and we're talking about how a lot of times low income folks and folks that are kind of recently middle class ascendant will like spank their kids. And we're talking about like communities of color, for example, in particular. And I kind of came up with this analogy that, like Black folks, Latino folks oftentimes spank their kids so the state won't kill them.
Yeah.
And so I think oftentimes when we're thinking about like queer communities, particularly like gay communities as opposed to queer communities, but like same-sex loving or same-gender loving communities, we will chastise each other. We'll throw shade, we'll read, we'll talk about this person's gender presentation and why that's not valid and how this politic ain't right and they're a top and they're a bottom and she's a bulldyke and all these other things are happening. And we do that oftentimes in a way to, one, make ourselves feel more secure in the space that we're in, because we're often standing on one foot doing the dance of limbo, not knowing if we're going over, if we're going to hopscotch. But also so that it also has the effect, rather, of that when that person gets called an even worse name or gets punched in the face because of who they are, their skin's a little bit tougher when they walk into the world. But so we believe oftentimes that we're preparing others and that we're strengthening ourselves, but what we're really doing is practicing this community ritual of suicide. We're consuming each other with these punches, with these kicks, with this shade, with this reading at all times. And so on the short term, it does make our skin a little bit thicker. It gives us calluses, but I've never wanted to shake a calloused hand. And if a hand doesn't have to be callous, why should it be?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there are things that we do that are violence and are short-term survival skills, and these survival skills take away from the practice of living and thriving.
Yeah, and that's actually the next thing I wanted to ask you about, is to tease out a little bit more. We were talking earlier about survival versus living and how that intersects with death, and particularly when death is more imminent or challenging. So can you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so we didn't talk about this earlier, but I love Maya Angelou. She's my favorite writer of all time, and she has this quotation, and it, some people vary it, but it basically says, "My purpose in life is not merely to survive, but to live and thrive with passion, compassion, humor, and a little bit of style." And I think that should really be the world's guiding politic. And I think that if you're a queer person and you're trying not to die, right, and you want to actually enjoy the process of being present, then that has to be your politic. It has to be beyond feeding yourself and making it till tomorrow and working that 9, 10, 15-hour or 2 20-hour jobs, you know what I mean, a week, sometimes even more. It has to be beyond maintaining and not
Mm-hmm.
dying, because that's kind of a robotic and kind of depressive life.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but when you get to this process of living, it's really about maximizing the moment and owning space. And not
Mm-hmm.
owning space in this capitalistic sense that no one can breathe your air, but to in this little space that I'm in, I will be me. No matter what you do, no matter what you say, no matter what you bring up against me, death, hell be damned, I will be me. Because
Mm-hmm.
not because it's a right that the state has given me or it's some called God-given right, it's because I am already me.
Mm-hmm.
And to do anything less than is to fold myself into little pieces and to actually consume myself. So queer people really have a choice between surviving, which can stop you from being murdered or killed, which is really important, right? And we're all sitting, at least the two of us right now, to have this conversation sitting in a space of privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Say these things outside and identify as such.
Mm-hmm.
But on the side of, like we were saying, the survival and the death, there's also this question of living. Living and surviving are not the same thing. Living is saying, this is my world. I'll breathe this air and I'll be myself, even if it's for 30 seconds, damn it, it was worth it.
Mm-hmm.
I
So
breathe.
how do you do that in your life? That sounds
Yeah.
super beautiful.
It, it's not always as pretty as it is lyrical, but for me, when I first came out, I was lucky enough to get a scholarship to go to Nelson Mandela's boarding school, the United World College. See my lighting going off now. But anyway, so I went to United World College in New Mexico, and 2 days before I left, my mother, back in the day we had MySpace and Zynga, and I was doing this kind of two-step that a lot of, but not all gay men do, where they identify as bi first and then become out as gay because it's more comfortable.
Mm-hmm.
It's more protective to desire women still, not be completely weird. But basically, so I was like identifying as bi. My mom's on my laptop. She's like, "Your MySpace says that you're bi," and I was like, "Yo, peace. My best friend's outside in the car, rolling off to New Mexico. See you in 2 years." But for me, that's the funny version. But the reality was, I had to tell my mother that, like, if you cannot accept me for who I am and love me for who I am, we don't need to have a relationship. So for 2 years, there was no communication with any of those parts of my family. And I was writing these kind of painstaking letters coming out and being like, "No, I don't have AIDS. No, I don't have 5 boyfriends." Even though I later end up, contracting HIV, which was completely different scenario. But at the same time, there were these barriers and these walls I had to put up to protect my freedom from those who would just want me to survive. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because everyone can't love you into freedom. Some people's love, as we talked about earlier in our chat, is actually, let me see if I can fix our lighting. Some people's love is actually parasitic. And not because they're bad people, but because that's how they know how to love.
Mm-hmm.
They've never known or never been able to practice a type of critical love ethic. Instead, what they've known is a love that says, "I'll get you till tomorrow." Feeding you, paying your bills, clothing you, that is love, the bare necessities. So they confuse survival with love,
Mm-hmm.
survival and daily kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not necessarily.
Just had to change the lighting back. So we're talking about freedom and breath and living and making choices that might not be easy, and what does love look like? And you have something you coined, the critical love ethic, and that's something I would love to share with folks, especially as it relates to this idea of queer body love, and what is that, and what is it to love ourselves in the face of oppression?
Yeah, so I came up with this idea when I was reading Bell Hooks' trilogy All About Love. And if folks haven't read that, please read it. Bell Hooks is one of the best writers ever, and if you disagree with her, her writing is so beautifully simplistic. If you're like 3rd grade, you can understand it because she's such a dope writer. She can break anything down. But basically, she had come up with this idea of kind of like a love ethic. And she was thinking about love and prescribing love as kind of the practice of freedom. And she was saying essentially that love itself is a practice, and it's connected to our values, you know. And so whatever values you have, that's what you'll bring in love. That's how you'll show up in love. And when you love your earnest and you love your best and your hardest, what's going to happen is your great values and your terrible values are then going to be brought to this partnership with someone. And if your values are, you know, corrupt or, you know, terrible or violent, that's what's going to be happening. Even though you're practicing love, you could be still, you know, demolishing the partner that you love in your own mind or in your own way. And so what I began to think about then is trying to take that to the next step and think about a type of critical love ethic. So you put the critical before that, it's talking about bringing the critical analysis. So not only is love, as Bell Hooks says, is this kind of mutual and co-investment in your growth, whether that's economic, intellectual, spiritual, emotional, and financial. Now it's doing a critical analysis of the ways in which that your love practice is either one, undergirding the systems of power that we live in society in ways of knowing that we've kind of invested in day to day, or it's undoing it. It's either undergirding or it's undoing. There is no standing in the middle. And so it basically says the way that you love your partner then is going to have a flow out effect on the rest of the community that you live in, right? And the way that you love your child. And these are the ways in which that we're now being taught to interact with people and to how to best fulfill and help people grow. So the ways in which you kind of think about the world, the ways in which you deal with like processes of, or even if you think about it all, processes of humanization or dehumanization are now going to kind of be replicated in the rest of the world in the ways in which you interact with other people.
Yeah, for sure. Do you have any examples of that in your own life of moments when you've noticed, oh, this feels like a critical love moment of either side of it? This is perpetuating or
I had like in my last relationship, I had this really huge like schism happen, and it was so disturbing. So my one of my ex-partners, they also they identify as non-binary, and they're also a person of color, and they are very, very queer, and have one of the dopest politics I've ever seen in life. They're a dope person. But in our relationship, they seem to take this role in our household that was very like gender broken, right? So you have two non-binary Black queer people in a household, and one is wanting to kind of take on this like I'll cook, I'll clean, very subservient role, and then I'm kind of being made into kind of this de facto man in the house, right? And we've already identified as both non-binary. So this one is like, okay, well, like this is how you want to be loved. Love also requires consent, right? But this is also knowing for me that this is the ways in which the production of labor has been broken in half in this country. And this is how sexism, whether you're people of the same gender or sex in house or not, has been born and maintained. So we can't simply have this like, I'll take out the trash and do all these manly things, and you'll do all these like, you know, more so-called feminine things or womanly things that are like obviously cis heterosexist, and then act like we're doing like a queer politic here, right? Because if I'm treating you this way at all times and I'm expecting you to kind of pay less bills and have sex in a particular way, then like what then have we done that's different than society, right? It's one thing to go and write about a blog piece about how we're having queer love and how we're doing this kind of like anti-racist, anti-sexist love practice in our household. But at the end of the day, in our household, we're actually not doing that, you know? And so for us, it became that we had to have this like really frank conversation about, wait, why do I desire the way I desire to be in this house, right? What is it that's erotic and fulfilling to me about the ways in which you're treating me in this way? And it was because, in the end of the day, they wanted a type of like traditional household. There's nothing wrong with wanting that, but we also had to define what traditional meant. And for me, I was so invested in being queer that I was looking beyond and past what their own needs and desires were, right? So when you talk about a critical love ethic, it's also like it's centering this person in their life and like, you know, how they interact and what they need and how they feel and how they communicate and need love and want love. But it's also thinking about like, wait a minute, like how does that affect my own politic? And how is that going to change the ways in which I feel about myself? And then how does the way in which I feel about and see myself govern how I'm going to act in the world?
Right.
And so that was like a really kind of hard impasse to get through for a while.
Yeah, it's super complicated because obviously these larger systems have impacted, you know, our erotic selves and what we desire. And like you're saying, if there's nothing wrong with the desire, but at the same time there is something that feels out of alignment, and then how do you reconcile like being with that person, putting that person first, the relationship first, and also reconciling that with your politic? That sounds super challenging.
And that's what we were talking about earlier before we got started recording, was saying that, you know, if you want to know someone's politic, look at the way they treat those in their relationships. or at home. And then the other thing that I truly believe, and I said earlier, is that I believe that sex is the highest and most honest form of politics. Someone's politics will always be relived or, kind of made more visible and explicit through the ways in which they have sex, through the people that they're attracted to, how they're attracted to, and how they go about even engaging them. And those type of desires. We know our desires are governed by the systems and the cultures that we live in. These ways of meaning making. So I always find it to be very, very interesting to say.
So how do you push that within yourself? How do you reconcile the tension or start to, it sounds like you're in a practice of trying to shift your desires to more closely match your politic. Am I hearing that correctly?
Oh yeah, it's been such a struggle. I think that when I first came out, I had a thing where I was just like, and this is so gay male foolishness. I was like so attracted to and looking for masculine men. They had to be masculine, they had to be so fit. And then I also realized that I was doing this thing with racial distancing, right? Because I knew I was Black and my grandmother was involved with a lot of radical Black organizations, which was dope. But also I knew that being seen as a particular type of Black, this culture race thing, could get me killed quicker. And this was kind of subconscious to me, right? So I've kind of worked through this and now I know. But then I was just I was really attracted to lighter skinned, masculine men. I wasn't gonna go all the way to white. Now that was a little step too far. But I was attracted to light skin, sometimes multi or biracial, masculine Black men. And it took me a long time to try to figure out what is it about these fools that I'm so attracted to? Oftentimes, they know that they're the ones that are kind of put up on this pedestal so they can do some foolish things. And this is not to say all light-skinned boys are fuckboys, but a lot of times they have more motivation to do so because, they're kind of held up in a particular way in community and across racial spaces and locations. And so for me, over the last, I think I started thinking about this more heavily when I was 21. So over the last 6-7 years, I started really thinking wait, he's really cute. But why is he really cute? Right? And it really just kind of sitting in that and thinking about why am I more attracted to these pink lips than my own lips? What is actually happening here? And obviously everyone doesn't have the time. I was at Tufts University, so I had time and space to kind of think about, and I was forced to because professors like Christina Sharp and others that really think about violence and sex and memory and desire and slavery and these legacies all together. I had time to think about that. Everyone does have that privilege. But for me, I really had to sit back and think holy shit. And when I had to break through, I was damn, bro. Who taught you to hate yourself, as Malcolm would say? And that's really what it was. I was trying to reach for something, not necessarily that was anti-Black, not because I hated Black people, but because I hated being so close to what I noticed, a particular type of death that is particular to Black people. And that is particular to Black, gay, effeminate people. I didn't want to catch that. It was almost like a smallpox. It was I was going to catch this disease that would mark me as destined and ready and deserving of a particular type of death. So I had to run away. I had to run away quickly. I was coming from Section 8, low-income household in inner Kansas City, and also being from rural country at the same time. I was whatever I do, I'm not going back to that shit. Yeah. So if I got to wrap up this sexuality, I got to dress up this Blackness, I'm going to get this degree and do that. But by sophomore year, I had a whole identity crisis and came out this whole radicalized Black queer person, so.
So what shifted for you? You were thinking about it, and then it sounds like there was a turning point.
Yeah, it was just a lot of stuff was happening at Tufts. I became president of Black Student Union. We had been, I guess Tufts Black students had been demanding an African American Studies program or major or minor since literally to the year of Barack Obama's birth, the month of Barack Obama's birth. And Barack Obama was, well into halfway into his first term, we suddenly got a minor. And so I had taken those classes with Christina Sharp. We had a class in a plantation on campus. Our school still has slave quarters standing on it. And that completely just rupture. We had this class in the slave quarters, and somehow me and my professor, who's a petite Black woman, bald, she was all Black all the time. She's maybe 5'1", this beautiful dark red lipstick, and we're having the class, and she speaks like this. She said, "Class, I want you to begin to remember the things that markedly happened in this house. What does it feel like to be here and to be you?" And it's us two Black people in this class of white Jewish kids. And I'm just oh shit, this is really awkward. And so I'm we both go to the bathroom and everyone else goes outside. And it being a slave quarters, of course it locks from the outside. So the door shuts somehow. And we're slave quarters. Oh my God. And being in that slave quarter for I think it could have been more than 2 minutes. It was such a harrowing experience to be locked in there and to really begin to think about this absence of really distance of time. Like, obviously slavery was like hundreds of years ago, 200 years ago, maybe, kind of, halfway, 140. Black codes 100 years ago, mass incarceration. So still slavery, basically. But it was in that moment, time had closed. We were locked in the damn slave quarters. She had a PhD as one of the most renowned scholars on African American studies. I'm a first generation high school graduate, college graduate, all these things. I was like, holy shit. But in that moment, I could feel and hear the narratives of the women that we know that lived in those and died in those very slave quarters and were raped in that very room. You could feel that closeness. And in feeling that, it instantly like radicalized me. It completely changed the ways in which I thought about like being Black in this space in this time. I mean, that there being any rupture between what Belinda, who was, the first enslaved woman to get reparations, who lived in that slave quarter and was raped there multiple times, and myself, who was sitting there getting a college degree, and so it made me learn and feel that the arc of time is not broken; it's actually circular. And what are you going to do in the circle?
That's quite
So,
poetic, and also got chills hearing that
yeah,
story. It sounds like a really, like you're saying, harrowing and intense
yeah,
moment.
yeah. It was different.
um, so Black queer, can you talk a little bit about your theory and creation of that word idea? And if you want to talk about also just the project and website.
Yeah. So we'll start with the end and go to the beginning. So Black Queer Flow is my my website, and it started off when I first found out my HIV status. I had gotten raped and contracted HIV my sophomore year of college, which actually happened like maybe like the month before this Belinda slave quarter story. So I was just having a hell of a birthday month of December 2012. Right. I was like, shit, like what else could happen? That's a fucking birthday. Like what the hell?
Oh my
But
God.
like I was having this rupture, and I was like writing, and I was reading all these things and trying to figure out like, one, I'm taking all these like feminist theory classes, right? And feminist theory, and it was like gender theory, and it was really like white gay theory, and I was just like, okay, white gays. This has nothing to do with my life. This is not ringing true for me. So we talk about racism, and we can talk about like Black gender and how Black people have always been all genders and also genderless in the American context. And there was none of that complication happening. And then when I go to my like Black or critical race theory or Afrocentric theory like classes, and there'd be no talk about like queerness. And then I read, I think it was it Saidiya Hartman? Yes, it was. I think it was Saidiya Hartman, or maybe it wasn't. No, it wasn't. It was another scholar. But the piece was called "Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe: An American Grammar Story." Oh, no, Hortense Spillers. Okay, yes, Hortense Spillers wrote it. And there was a line in there where she said, the Black Atlantic has always been the queer Atlantic. And I was like, holy shit. So she's talking about like Black bodies being transported across the Atlantic in these musty ships. And like that being a Black experience, but that fundamentally being a queer experience. And I was just like, wait a minute, there's no rupture. There's no rupture between Blackness and queerness. We were actually born of the concept of Blackness, obviously not Black people, but the concept of Blackness and the concept of queerness were actually born in the same spot of like death and despair and hope and possibility and survival and thriving in the bottom of a ship in the Atlantic where Black bodies are dead piled on top of each other of living bodies, right? And folks that are speaking different languages and tongues being brought together. And so there's like an entire queering and blackening of their essence because they don't speak the same language. They're not from the same countries. They're not even from the same tribes. They just know that they may even have a different skin texture, but they look kind of more similar than the folks who've captured them or sold them. And in that moment, there was a oneness. And so in creating like the blog Black Queer Flow, I was beginning to kind of think about those of us that are like Black and gay, but also like Black and have this queer politic, whether it's sexual, whether it's just political, and noting that there's always this flow within us. It's governing how we survive. There's this dance of limbo between life and death that we're always doing. There's a code switching that we're always doing. There's this duality that Du Bois, however you want to pronounce it, talks about, like Black people being able to see the United States as it is, as a Black people, and this kind of like bird's eye view, but we also have to be able to see it as white people see it. Now, I would argue today, even as people of color see it, because there's oftentimes this like anti-Blackness and this using of a Black experience that people of color use to get particular types of freedom and struggle strategies, which is interesting. I don't know what just happened. Yeah, so there's that. And so for me, it was noting that like there does not need to be a rupture
Mm.
myself to be both Black and queer. There's no competition. Both of them
Mm-hmm.
have always been here. There's
Mm-hmm.
always been a flow within my spirit. And in fact, as good old white gay Walt Whitman says, I am a cosmos. And so that's where the concept of Black queer came from. It is this idea that actually Black gay and Black queer politically identified folks have no ruptures. We've always just been. There is
Mm-hmm.
no decision that must be made. There is no circumcision that must be cut apart from us to exist as ourselves. And in
Mm.
fact, if we do that, as we were talking about earlier, we begin to kind of commit this type of community euthanasia or suicide.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak more about what queerness is to you?
Yeah, so I see queerness in contrast, I guess I won't say in opposition, that's not nice, to gayness. So I think that like gayness, or we're talking about gay men or women, we're talking people that are like same sex, or some scholars will interestingly say same gender loving or attracted, which I don't even know what it means to be same gender attractive, because how do you even know someone's gender until you ask? Like, do you start being attracted to them after you ask their name and their gender? Or it's just weird, whole
Well,
nother
it's
tangent.
kind of saying the same with sex, so.
Yeah. No, so
Either.
it's just like really like some weird assumption, strange shit happening right now. But like, so as opposed to kind of this like sexual or physical attraction that kind of like undergirds or basically is the only connecting factor besides oppression of gayness or same sex or same gender attraction, with queerness, we're talking about a political belief that all people that with beating hearts are alive, maybe you don't have a beating heart, but are alive, right? Have, well, I hate the word rights, not this like rights from the state, but deserve and are entitled to from us as other human beings, this ability to live, this ability to come into fruition, this ability and this kind of like gift of being to eat healthy food, to come to as their true self and to be without assault as themselves in this world just because they are. Not because of where they were born, not because they're citizens, not because they're gay or straight or queer or politically correct. They could be the most disturbing person in the world, but because they are, they have the right to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is something that, other people, from Stonewall on, like Marsha P. Johnson, and so we're able to say in a different way. But I think that is this kind of undergirding politic of queerness that, one, it's a politic, two, it's an action, and three, it has to govern the ways in which you interact with the world. Me being queer is not necessarily about me being attracted to men or women or trans folks or what have you, or all the above. It's about when I'm attracted to folks, how do I treat them? And how is that politic of treating other people guiding me, and what's undergirding it, right? And so queerness itself, the way I think about it, is not only this affirmative view of the world, but it's also an opposition to dehumanization wherever it happens.
Mm-hmm.
It's not,
Yeah.
queerness does not recognize any borders or boundaries to humanization. In fact, if you really want to think about queerness, it doesn't even recognize the humanization because no one can be dehumanized.
Mm-hmm.
But that is what queerness is. It's a question and it's an opportunity for possibilities of folks being able to simply live and thrive, as Maya says, not just survive.
Mm-hmm.
It goes beyond fucking.
Yeah, totally. It goes beyond fucking. That's a good encapsulation of that. And I feel so inspired by that and so curious about then how that intersects with the identity piece, or, like a straight person who's like, yeah, I mean, of course, all humans. So like, what's the difference between, for example, to make a parallel that's, not exactly a parallel, but when people are like, oh, all lives matter, it's like, how do we also claim the specificity of a queer experience that's not a straight heteronormative way of
Yeah.
the
So I
world?
mean, it definitely is like the All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter, and I think even with that comparison, some people are somehow still lost. I don't know how, but and even just an example to break both those: gayness versus queerness, All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter. The difference is in the practice, right? Because in saying All Lives Matter, tongue in cheek, you're really saying Black Lives Matter, and when Black people say Black Lives Matter, they're really saying Black Lives Matter matter in addition to all you other lives that have been mattering. So what we're really talking about now is not just the belief, which is step one. We hope you're all there. We'll give you the benefit of doubt of believing that all people matter. But now we're saying, when we say Black Lives Matter, or we're talking about a politic of queerness, queerness demands that now there's a practice that makes sure
Right. Okay.
that all
Yeah.
lives matter.
Right.
Yes. And if they don't, there's a consequence.
Right.
Queerness ain't like, oh, that's so sad. You broke my heart because this life don't matter. They're starving. Oh, no, no, no. There's a cost. Someone has to pay.
Yeah.
Doesn't have
That's
to necessarily
helpful.
be violent, but it could be, you know.
Right. Like there's a sensitization to the dehumanization that perhaps
Mhm.
somebody who lives with more privilege might not necessarily even notice without
Mhm.
having that particular orientation.
Right. And I would say that queerness demands a mechanism because I think oftentimes we talk about a politic and people think a politic is just a belief.
Okay.
No, there's a mechanism for correction.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So even when you had like Martin Luther King is very whitewashed right now, but the radical Martin Luther King of the 60s would say that, listen, everyone in society deserves a place to sleep, a roof over their head, and 3 healthy meals and a proper education.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody, regardless of the ability to pay, regardless of criminal status, regardless of citizenship.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, right? And like that is some real, like in your mind, that's basic. Well, yeah, everyone. But really, when we think about it, when we say everyone, we really usually don't mean everyone. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that queerness demands that, and it also demands a mechanism to make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's hope in action, you
What do you
know.
think about in terms of mechanisms?
Yeah, so I think about a lot of things, and this is where I get in trouble with a lot of my fellow organizer, theorist, poet friends, and I get more in sync with a lot of my like lawyer friends. It's a weird straddling those like the creative versus law versus scholar
Yeah.
law. I'm in a
Yeah.
weird place. That's why my brain be like this. But no, I think that there is a role for every sector in society. I think the state, as much as I am not a fan of the state as far as like, the whole state apparatus, the whole government has a huge role to play. I think that communities have a huge role to play. When I say community, I don't mean the community of Kansas City, Kansas. I mean the community of 17th and Troost in Kansas City, Kansas has a role to play in making sure that these types of dehumanization are not functioning there. If
Mm-hmm.
they are, they're whittled down. And so when I think about kind of like the roles of mechanisms, I think about it almost as inverted pyramid. Like it starts off small and the mechanism remains steady and becomes more powerful as you go through. So a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people talk about affirmative action. I don't know what that is. I believe in corrective action, right? So I think that like affirmative action, as people call it, which I would call corrective action, has the role of correcting the kind of ways in which the economy and society has been skewed because of white supremacy. And that is
Mm-hmm.
one mechanism that you can use when we talk about processes of rehumanization,
Mm-hmm.
correcting dehumanization. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that if we have a queer politic, these are a type of clear mechanisms, and sometimes they'll be varied and they'll change based upon locale and what's happening in a specific area. These are the types of mechanisms that we'll have to have put forth. It can't just be a kind of like Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, a rising tide lifts all boats type of thing, because some boats had holes knocked in them.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very interesting, and I think that like there's a type of like consciousness or conscientiousness that goes into thinking about what these mechanisms could and should
Yeah,
be.
for sure. And something I really appreciate about you is hearing it from the micro to the macro scale, right?
Hmm.
So, like thinking about how we love and how we're in relationship to the
Hmm.
larger systems and how do we correct the things that have been skewed,
Hmm.
like you're saying.
Right.
I want to shift gears for now and talk about gender. What is
Mhm.
your experience journey with your own gender?
It's been a journey. I mean, we talked about that a little bit with kind of like how my attractions have worked, but it's been really intriguing for me because I think a lot for the Black community, there's a lot of like assumption about this kind of like Black man. Even when we come out as like gay or bi, like a lot of Black male bodied people, whether they identify as men or not, or at least formerly male bodied people, are marked in a way we have to be this other way because we're like the saviors of Black community, because obviously Black women are inept and can't do anything. That's apparently the way the world works. Interesting stereotype. But yeah, so for me, I had an interesting journey because I was raised by kind of this almost like this village of like very strong, very headstrong, very hard-headed, very Black women that did everything, right? That worked 14-hour days at the 3M factory, that were hairstylists, but also had degrees. Well, not degrees, but, kind of had like the know-how of nursing that had been passed down from great-grandmother to
Mm,
grandmother and through slavery to the present. These kind of just things that you just know because you've always been taught. So for me, it's been really interesting because my mother and my grandmother, who I grew up with and took turns basically raising me, um, dealt with a lot of abuse and violence from the men in their lives. So they were both raped, molested, and beaten to bloody pulps by their partners and other people in their family. And so it's been interesting for them. We talked about this morning. We're having coffee too, to have kind of engaged in the production of a Black male And I was like, what, like, why are you so invested in me being a man? And their answer really was that we didn't know what, if you were anything else, you would have been killed, right? And so there's necessity of a Black boy or Black male-bodied or boy-bodied child to become a man, because if not, then what else is it going to be? What will happen to it? There's no other example. And so it was very interesting to me, because one, being raised by Black women, it opened up the possibility for me to be a different type of Black man, whatever a Black man is, right? There were those hard edges of the men that they had loved and been consumed by that I did not have to be, and they would be damned if I was. But there was still this kind of like core interest in this production of Black manhood, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so even though they were queering it in their own way and producing it in their own way and making sure I knew how to cook and clean and do my own hair no matter how long it got, because they didn't want to do it, really. So and they would always make this joke, and I was like, well, we don't want you to depend on no woman. Well, they never knew that I would not be dependent on a woman. Oh. So our grandma was like, dang, my grandma was like, I don't know what I did. Like, yeah, I don't know what I did. But what's interesting to me is that in that, though, they were still trying to produce a Black man, even though it was a different type of Black man. Mm-hmm. So, they kind of like dealt with the terror of Black men, but still somehow engaged in the community production of it. So my gender has kind of like gone interesting ways. When I first came out, or I was in the process of coming out, or being outed by my mother, rather, I really clung hard to being this like masculine, but still creative Black man. Like, I was state boxing champion. I played varsity football, basketball, track. I was much bigger in high school than I am now, which is ridiculous. But as kind of like went by, I started realizing that not only was I not myself, I was killing myself in order to be what I thought I needed to be to survive. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what I talk about in my book, Godless Circumcisions, is, for a lot of people of color and for a lot of queer folks, especially Black queer folks, when we walk into a room, or when we try to get a job, or when we go into our households amongst our loving families that are loving us the best way they know how, which are oftentimes violent and parasitic. One of my favorite professors would say home is where the hatred is sometimes, which is us to consider. But there are parts of us that have to be cleaved apart in order to sit in that space, right? In order to feed my belly, I might have to starve my soul. And that is a very strong, hard question, and a hard thing to balance. And so when I moved to New Mexico for boarding school, and then I moved to Tufts for college, I made a decision that I would not starve my soul anymore to feed my body. This was not going to happen, because the reality was I was beating the hell out of my body too, going to the gym and getting all this muscle that I was never going to use. I wasn't going to no damn NFL. I didn't want to be a boxer. I hated that shit. I hated having a bloody, swollen lip. I liked for my hair to be laid. I like to stand behind a podium and deliver a rousing speech or sermon or poem that was going to get people to get their life and to really, like Maya Angelou says, I like to tell a young scholar or a young child to take life by the lapel and say, hey man, life is with me. You know what I mean? Life is mine. And that's the type of work I've always wanted to do, even from the time I was a child. But I always thought that men didn't get to have feelings in particular ways. Men could not be concerned with freedom. Men had to be concerned with using force for whatever they did. And that's how you were a man. And so when I let go of these kind of demarcations of Black humanization, which is really, how do you become the closest to masculinity even if you're a woman? How do you perform strength in this creative way in order to be human? When I let that go, I was able to let go of using my own true essence as a punching bag. I was able to let go of consuming other Black people around me and other men and women, other queer folks, regardless of their gender presentation, around me in order to see myself as valuable and worthy to sit where I sit. When I started seeing myself as myself and really loving that person in practice and in ideology, then it didn't really matter where the hell I was. I could be wearing and this is me, wearing a damn bikini on the beach, in no type of shape, not giving a damn, because I'm mine. I bought this. What's the problem? The earth is mine too. Or, I could be standing in front of a podium in an amazing suit, giving a great speech, and still feel present, and still feel myself, and not worry about what these people in the audience who are much more credentialed than me are thinking. And so that type of comfort with my gender, or rather in this case, my aversion to gender, because I don't identify with any gender really, has allowed me to feel comfortable giving talks at the White House or receiving awards there, but also being able to walk into, a freaking sex party and get my life right? So like there are all these particular parts of my politic and myself that for many people, they don't feel comfortable being in a boardroom, but also in the club, on the streets, in the hood, right? For me, I can be anywhere. It doesn't really matter because I'm engaged in the practice of living and I'm engaged in my own critical love ethic that situates me no matter where I am.
Mm. Super inspirational.
Yeah, super expensive. Because there are places and people and go of. Everyone cannot practice freedom with you. Some people will eat your freedom. Some people will eat your essence. And you have to let them go. And that's expensive. I've lost a lot of friends over it. You know? But I love myself more than I love any friend. So, you know, everyone can't go with you.
Yeah. Big sacrifices for the sake of really living and freedom and expression.
Yeah.
What do you think is as somebody who's really grounded in words, what do you think is the benefit and the danger of labels and identities? Like, for example, you're saying your aversion to gender.
I love words so much. I love words more than anything else in the world. And I hate words more than anything else in the world. Like literally words are the double-edged sword of living. So like, look, words allow you to mark yourself. And then the problem with words is they allow you to mark yourself. Sometimes we think some of these marks are tattoos and not just drawings. You know, we get kind of caught up in what we said we were, and so when what we define as we and us get kind of like static for some reason. And I think people forget that, like, when you write, when you're learning how to write in elementary school, you start with a pencil. The thing about a pencil is you can erase things, and even when you type something, you can backspace, and even when you print it out, you can white it out. Right? And if you can't white it out, guess what? You can light the page on fire and write it again. You know what I mean? And so, like, I think that sometimes we get imprisoned by words, but also we can be freed by words. Like as a child, reading Maya Angelou's I Know What the Cage Bird Sings is the first book I read as a child, and I had already gone through like sexual violence at like 7 years old. So I was like reading this, getting my whole life, and I'm like, I should not have been knowing what she was talking about at 7. But that book, hearing her words, hearing her describe trauma and her fears and going through and moving through and then becoming this world-renowned author freed me, right? But then I also think about like the words that I got from, you know, my dad, who wasn't really around, that from my uncles and sometimes my grandmother and them, about like what it meant to be a man, imprisoned me, right? And so I think that sometimes we get so wrapped up in words that we forget what we mean. Because the thing about words is they're able to give you fragments of truth. You know, there are things that the tongue and the written word just cannot comprehend because they're beyond us. We haven't gotten there yet. And so really words are a breaking down of reality into itty bitty pieces that can be remembered and be recalled, but can never be really held fully for the whole full experience of what that thing you were feeling was. Things get lost in translation. So when we talk about like labels, I think that labels are important for the moment, and for marking history, and for guide and roadmaps, and for, you know, kind of like strategizing what comes next. But what words do not do, and what labels and identities do not do, is create humanity. They paint pictures of it. They describe it. You know, I mean, it's like an artist making a portrait of you. You can get so close, but an artist is only doing the surface. It's not getting down to the molecular level. And that's what living is. Living is this combination of all your whole essence. And words are that good old sketch, you know, good old courtroom sketch of that thing that lets you be able to recognize and know what somebody's talking about shorthand real good, not having to have to live it yourself. But what it does is it takes away room for life, takes away fluidity, takes away freedom, honestly, if you let it.
So why is it that so Black queer, Blackness and queerness feels like something that it sounds like something you do identify with, as opposed to gender, where you have an aversion to labels there. And I'm curious about why why claim that one and not that one?
Oh yeah. So I think that history, right? So like, I think that like Black people historically have never really been able to have gender. When people say women, they don't think about Black women. And when you draw a picture of a woman, it doesn't generally look like a Black woman. And there's these kind of like things that people do with women with femininity and things, that if you come from, you know, a working class or middle class or even like an upper middle class Black family, these are not things that Black women generally are prescribed to as much. There's a type of strength, whether it's natural or learned, that Black come into have because of racism, right?
Mm.
And that's just, and not because of just racism, but also racial sexism. So
Mm-hmm.
there's just, and also racial sexism that's also classed, right? So there are things that like gender-wise, Black people do not have access to.
Mm.
And so when Black people begin to kind of like identify with certain genders, there's always this kind of like, there's this performance gap. Black people can never perform gender because gender is really whitened.
Mm.
It's about whiteness. So we're always kind of like gasping or rather grasping for a particular type of gender that is actually out of our reach by the virtue of the color of our skin and how white folks read it.
Mm.
So gender can never really be truly performed by Black people, and the ways in which that it's kind of articulated by the white masses. It's just not something that we're able to do because we're not humanized in white minds that way.
Right.
So there's that, and I think for me to identify with gender is also to erase the ways in which slavery has always undone gender, and
Mm.
Jim Crow was undone gender, and mass incarceration has undone gender. So there's that, but also at the same time, I think that gender is more of a performance than Blackness and queerness are. I think
Mm.
queerness is a politic, and I think Blackness is a designation that's
Mm.
been made real by racial sexual terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and like there's a reason, you know, that like we understand the gender as a performance and as a malleable identity in the
Mm-hmm.
ways in which we don't Blackness.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel Dolezal tried to be transracial. That
Right.
was, I said, girl, you know, if believe me, if this was possible, people would have figured this shit out long. Every slave on the damn ship would have figured, no, I ain't Black no more, girl. No, I'm sorry. Like, so that's very interesting. And I think that points to what we all know in society about the difference between gender and race. So the difference between me identifying as Black, queer, and male are that one, gender is malleable. And
Mm-hmm.
gender is this kind of like interesting performance. Now,
Mm-hmm.
now how you perform it can get your ass killed. But Blackness in and of itself is really a political and legal death sentence in the United States.
Right.
Some of us are able to obscure it for a long time, but it's a dance.
And you were talking about, yeah, earlier, gender as a community production also, which I think was an interesting, yeah, it's pointing to what you're talking about in terms of the malleability, the production, creation. And I really appreciate that breakdown of the different identities and history and context and how that's impacted you.
Yeah, definitely. And I was talking about earlier, you know, my grandmother, my mother were able to kind of like, in me, because, like, you know, they raised me as like single women, produce this particular type of like man, right? And so I was kind of imbued with their politics as women, but also their politics as like battered women who have survived particular types of violences. So there's also like ways in which I don't yell at my partners. I don't believe in that. There are ways in which, you know, I operate in the house, right? So I cook and I kind of do all these things, right? Because my grandmother was like I said earlier, you're not gonna need a woman, which I really don't, or desire one. But their production of me was something that was communal, which is very different from the ways in which my uncles were invested in producing the man that my little brother is right now. He's an MMA, mixed martial arts, and a step away from being a UFC fighter, which is definitely not what Tobias was going to be doing. So I think that oftentimes we have to begin to think about like not just gender, male, female, masculine, feminine, patriarchy, anti-patriarchy as these kind of like just big systemic things, but noting that systems are really a collection of community productions of ideas and values, and even reproductions of ourselves that we choose to show into the world.
Yeah, totally. So one last question. What does your body have to say about this question of the series? How do we love ourselves, our bodies, and each other in the face of oppression?
Oh my God. My body is like happy right now. I think, I don't know if you saw the pictures I sent. I don't know if I sent them to you from the award ceremony. So I won the Voice of the Year award from BlogHer and She Media last week for a piece I wrote on my blog, The Revolution Not Be Hashtag. But anyway, I wore this beautiful African dress thing that I had custom made for me in South Africa. And so I'll just tell a short story about how I had this made. So I walk into like this like little strip mall in South Africa, right? And I think this girl's name, I don't know, her name is like Mama Gojo or something interesting like that. And I'm like walking up and I see this beautiful like dress on this mannequin. And I was like, oh my God, I want that. And she was like, huh? And I was like, no, I want that. And she's like, no, you're a man. You man, no. And I said, girl, you, like, not only do I want that, I want the waist tapered in tight. I want 2 high slits up each side, and I want a deep V-neck cut in it. I was like, money. You can either take the money or not. And so she like took the money, and then like she was just so like, this is not good for men, but you have great hips. And I'm just like, yeah, you're gonna make this. And so for me in that moment, that was the first time I really started like taking ownership of like, wait a minute, I do have some great thighs, and I can wear a DV, and I can wear a dress, and I wore that same dress for my award ceremony with these dangling earrings or what have you. And so my body, I think at this year at 27, has never been under more assault because it's so out there in the world, whether I'm wearing this bikini in Havana on the beach like I was in December on my good old breakup tour, or whether I'm wearing this like dress, you know, on stage in front of all these people in a recorded setting for getting an award. So my body is exposed to different types of like violence and vitriol and unwanted touching and all these things. So I'm putting it in this more feminine role, which, damn women, I see you now. It's I put on a dress. Everyone feels that they can touch my ass. Like, what? Like, what? You still see my beard, right? But no, my body, even though it's in more direct violence for breaking these gender roles, for breaking these like roles of what a Black man or a Black queer person or anyone that has, you know, masculine features should be doing, it feels so free. Like my body is just out here. You know, it's taken in the sun. It feels good. I feel comfortable in whatever I'm wearing, even though I see the kind of like impending doom of possible death and racial sexual terrorism. Even though I see, you know, death as this kind of like foreclosure coming in, I'm still able to practice living. And in fact, because I see death coming, I must practice living.
When I heard Tobias say that comment about, don't you see my beard, I felt my body clench up and myself shut down a little bit. And during the interview itself, I had this question of, do I ask or not, but feeling distant. And so I didn't ask in the interview itself. And then it ended and I asked open-hearted and curious what he meant by that comment. And he started breaking it down for me. And I really was appreciating his answer. So we decided to record it and put it in here. And for me, that was such a good example of how we can have a reaction to what somebody's saying. And when we can open and be curious to what they really mean by it, there's often a lot more there that we wouldn't have access to if we don't ask.
So I was just curious if you could elaborate a little bit on what you just shared in regards to, don't you see my beard, when people are wanting to touch you?
Yeah, so like as someone who is like, and this is kind of the flow in my Black queer flow, someone who is like, gender presentation is read as kind of like flowing somewhere in the air, like, you know, some type of flower, which you probably am. I've noted that like when I wear my African dress I was just talking about, or whatever it's actually called, that people tend to have this kind of access to my body. And this obviously what I've seen being read on femme bodies as this kind of like, not only access to a body, but access to a body without consent and without consequence. Right. And for someone who's often read as kind of like queer, no matter what I'm wearing, I'm usually a skinny jeans and short shorts, crop top type of person, so that's always there. But I've noted as like as I've grown this beard, it's been kind of this like notation of a consequence of transgression. So if you transgress and you touch in a particular way, there's like, yo, you about to get your ass whooped, right? Whereas like when I wear my dress, it's almost as if the dress overpower, which is so interesting. So it's like I'm noting on my body how these kind of racial, gender, sexual politics are all colliding at once, but then also being kind of like overwhelmed by what performance is saying. Because clearly if he's wearing this dress, right, or they're wearing this dress, or what pronouns you want to use for me, clearly the wearing and putting on this dead plant called cotton in a particular way now means I must in fact want to be violated in the ways in which all femme folks are. So it's almost like I'm doing a calling forth a violation, regardless of what my physical attributes or, you know, cis heteropatriarchy would say is a no-go zone for violence. So I'm just kind of noting that like, it was a kind of tongue-in-cheek way of kind of like noting like, wow, this game of survival jujitsu gets real weird when you start complicating your kind of physical attributes with the ways in which you dress yourself.
Yeah, which really speaks to the violence against trans women of color, particularly, right?
It does, and it speaks to it, but really just whispers to it, because people did not read me as trans in that space. They still read me as like a man with like snatched eyebrows and great hair in a dress, right? For all that was, but yet even with the man underneath, they felt like they could, should, and must, in fact, grab and touch anywhere they want to.
Yeah.
You know? And so even with that layer of protection, I was getting violated in a way in which it's just a whisper of the ways in which like Black trans women
Right.
are dealing every single day
Yeah.
because they don't have the covering of, cisness that
Yeah.
people.
How did you respond to that, or how are you thinking about how does that impact your experience in the world?
Yeah, so usually I respond to it like, do I know you? And like, are you? And I really like matter of fact like questions like, did you just touch me? Like what? I'm sorry, who are you? Like that type of thing. But in that space, and this is where really, because I was there with Jane and Mock, which is really interesting, and we like took a picture afterwards, and so I really got to think about this even deeper. It was just like, man, in this space, I have to be professional. I have to like drink my wine, take all these congratulations to folks. Oh, that was such a powerful reading. You did so well, blah, 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 blah. With them grabbing my cheek or touching my waist or loving, at the time I had my locks in, grabbing my locks. And that had to be okay because they were giving me thanks. They were showing me how valuable I was to them. And so in their mind, their touching is a compliment and a show and a type of giving an extra honor on top of the honor I already got as Voice of the Year. Not only are you Voice of the Year because you're dope writing, but you're even doper because I want to touch you and show you how appreciative I am of you, as if their violation is a gift. And that is where the fuckery of gender and race actually happen.
And power.
And the interesting thing for me was that it was mostly white women. So like, what does that also mean there, right? And on some Solange, don't touch my hair type of thing.
Right.
So it was a really interesting space to be on. I've been thinking about trying to write about it, but there's just so much to unpack when I'm just like, let me have 2 days.
Yeah, super complicated. And that was, you just got back from that trip. That's definitely a question that I've gotten from folks though, is like how to deal with catcalling and harassing, especially when there's safety involved. And
right.
I imagine that, it's different depending on context, but is there anything in particular that you would give as advice for that?
Well, and just to like kind of like even deepen that comment in that question is like safety.
Yeah.
We think about physical safety so much because like there's literally a genocide on Black trans women right now in America. But what I also think about safety is economic safety.
Right.
Because you can't afford to lose your job. That's healthcare.
Right.
Like that's very, very real. And like we have to broaden what we mean by safety and violence. But I can't give advice to trans women on that because that's just not my life. And I can take off the dress and I won't be just fine, but I will be better off. And I have the degrees that I have. So sure, I can get fired from, a job as an organizer or whatever I'm doing right now, but I can also go to a law firm and make 6 figures. I can also be an academic now. So I think it's out of turn for me to pretend to give advice. But I can say that what I've done for me with the privileges that I have is, one, note that in those spaces, I'm there because I'm valued. And I try to leverage the value that I do have. Right? Because there is some devaluation of me being in those spaces, like these white women always wanted to touch me. But there were ways in which I was able to, one, utilize the guy I had there as my date, who was a very muscular, cis Black male scientist who was able to kind of stand in the way and in the buffer for me. And then some of the women that I was like reading one of the keynotes with, I was able to kind of talk to them and allow them to kind of weaponize their white woman privilege to be like, wait a minute, actually, you don't need to like grab Tobias's waist or his hair or grab his cheeks because it's actually just not appropriate.
Yeah, totally.
So I think it is utilizing the resources that you have, if you have any.
Yeah, totally. Well, thanks so much for articulating all the complexity of that from that, the small comment and then being able to see all the nuance and complexity that's in there. So appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Any closing words for our Queer Body Love audience?
Yeah, I would just say that the highest form of love for yourself is love of yourself, and that in of itself is a practice. So if you don't have a way that you could explicitly say, not that you just love yourself, but you can demonstrate and say and guide someone into how you love yourself, you haven't gotten there yet. And none of us have arrived in like this, like, this space of like Dalai Lama, grand self-love, one with the universe. But we damn well should be on our way to it, regardless of religion or no religion. And so I'll just say that, and definitely, check out my lovely book, Godless Circumcisions, on Amazon, and our work at www.blackqueerflow, BLAQUER flow.com, also on Twitter. We're having our call for writers out right now, and artists and poets and speakers and thinkers. So join us because we're doing great work about remembering and recalling those pieces of ourselves that have since been cleaved away.
Beautiful. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Tobias. This is such a enriching conversation. I feel like I need to watch it a few times to really digest all of the ideas and ways that you're helping me think through these ideas differently than I have before. So thank you again for being part of the series.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So looking forward to hearing what people are thinking and feeling. Come on over to the Facebook group to share your thoughts, feelings, reactions, questions, and I'll see you at the next interview. Bye.